I've lost a tripod. How on earth do you lose a tripod? Because of that, I'm now in the market for a new travel tripod, so if you've got any recommendations, please do leave them down below for me. But today we are talking about the best lenses for landscape photography. There's no surprises here really, we're talking about the holy trinity of lenses, 16-35, 24-70 and 70-200. It's still going to be really useful to you though, because I want to have a look at each lens and think about how, why, when we might use that lens and how that will affect your landscape photography. But before we get into that, after the epic conditions I had on the video last week, quite a few of you complained that I didn't show enough of that last time lapse, so I want to sort that out now. So let's go. Right, lenses. Now, whilst I am going to talk about the lenses, particular lenses I use, I know a lot of you don't use Canon, so I want to more focus in on the focal length we're using and how that is going to affect things. I'm really keen to get people to start thinking about landscape photography as an art rather than just a technical exercise, and it absolutely is. And that's true with the focal length that we're using as well, because the different focal lengths will let us tell the story of that landscape in a different way. So it's important to know why you might use a particular lens in a particular situation to further that narrative that you're trying to tell. Right. Firstly, we have the 16-35 f4 from Canon. I chose this lens because it has image stabilization. I talked about it the other week. It's also quite light compared to the more expensive 2.8, which I don't really need 2.8 for landscape photography, so I went with this one for that reason. Now, it's still sharp, it's still decent. If you're using a cropped sensor camera, you're looking in the range of 10-20 or 10-22, depending on the lens you use, and that's going to give you a same sort of field of vision that this lens gives you on a full frame camera. I'm a big fan of wide angles with landscape photography. These kind of wide angles are what some people consider to be a landscape photography lens, and I think partly that's true. Now, what wide-angle lenses let us do is really open that field of vision and just get much more into the frame. And that's great. It's at certain times because you might want to show that whole beautiful vista. And it really helps us tell the story, particularly about the relationship between the foreground in your scene and the background. And wide angles are just great for filling the frame with that interesting foreground. And that's particularly true with things like rocks on a beach, or if you're high up on a craggy mountain, getting some of those crags in the foreground is really brilliant. But the important thing to know when you do that is that because you're nice and close in with the wide angle on that foreground interest, the background is then going to look very small. So in order to make this story work between the foreground and the background, you're going to need a really massive background. That can work really well at the beach because if you've got a sky, for example, full of colour, that's going to fill that background and really contrast that big foreground in your frame really nicely. The same is true in the mountains where I shoot a lot, because although those crags and foreground rock and things are going to be big in the frame, the mountains in the background are also massive, so you can get some nice detail and shape and things like that in your background, and it can work really well for that. There's also times when you just physically can't get any further back. It might be that you've got a wall behind you or a rock face or something, but you still want to have what you want to have in the scene. So having the wide angle will open that up for you and let you shoot. And that works in all areas of photography, like group shots and portraits and things like that. But sometimes you can't go any further back, so your only option is to have that wide angle. I think an important point to note here, and it's something people often get wrong, is that focal length does not change perspective. A normal rectilinear wide-angle lens does not create perspective distortion. What does create the perspective distortion is the difference between your subject and the camera. Perspective changes when your camera itself moves in relation to your subject. A good example of this, and to show this, is by doing two tests. The first one is if we shoot an object, any object, we'll use a cup in this example, shoot an object from a distance with both a wide angle lens and then a longer telephoto lens. If you then crop in on that wide angle image, the object will look exactly the same as it does in the telephoto shot if you haven't moved the camera. And then the second test is to then shoot the same object, but get it the same size in your frame with both lenses. So take the same shot, move the camera forward with the wide angle lens to get the subject the same, and then move back and do the same shot with the longer lens. Now, once you compare those two images, perspective has changed because the camera has moved and the images just look completely different because the perspective is different. The wide angle lens does not create that perspective distortion though. That's happened because you've moved closer to the image, and it's the distance between the camera and the object that has changed. This is true because if it was the lens itself that creates that perspective distortion, when you were shooting a distant mountain scene, the mountains would appear distorted as well, and they just don't. So it's just a point to be aware of that focal length does not affect perspective. Right, next one is the 24-70. I've got the Tamron 24-70. It's on this camera at the moment. I like this lens because it's about the same quality as the original Canon 24-70. It's also got image stabilization, which I need for video, and it's just a decent lens all around. When Canon release one with image stabilization, the 24-70 2.8, I probably will upgrade to that. But for now, this is doing me a great job. And a 24-70 lens, if I was only allowed to have one lens for landscape photography and pretty much all photography, that would be what I went for. It covers a really useful range. You're going to use pretty much all of that range at some point or another, and it just works so well. It feels natural as well because within that range is the focal length of our eyes, and it's just pretty much naturally we all know what to do with that range, and it's pretty much what your kit lens covers. All the compact cameras have that kind of range as well, so it's just very natural and very easy to use, and there's not much more to say about it. Right, next we have the lens hood on the 24-70, 70-200. I have the Canon f4 70-200. This is the most basic model. There are 4 in the Canon range. It's quite confusing. This is the lightest and the cheapest. The image quality is still excellent, so it works really nicely for me. But the 70-200 range it's really interesting for landscape photography. We can stand in front of a huge vista and really get in close and pull out the interesting elements in that scene. If there is only light on one part of that scene, get in and follow that light. Find the interesting things within that scene, and you can sometimes pull more than one image out of that same scene. You can be more creative with it as well, and you're essentially creating a portrait of the landscape with this lens, which is just really nice. One thing I love about the 70-200 is it gives you much better control of the story that you're trying to tell as well. Because say, for example, if you are stood, like I was the other day, in front of what is a stunning scene, focused in on something particularly interesting that's happening in front of me, that is driving the emotion that's coming from me. That is the story I'm trying to tell you. But if I was to shoot it wide and include everything else in that scene that I can actually see, that's going to distract from the story I'm trying to tell. All my focus is in there at 200mm, but to show you the wide image, it would just spoil it, and that bit of the story would get lost. So to get in nice and tight on that detail, on that interest, on that story, it lets you portray that through your work, and you're going to end up with a much better image. Sometimes the viewers, the people, they don't need to see what's outside of the frame because it's just not relevant. And if you really take a great image at 70-200, it stirs up the imagination of the viewer as well, and they can fill in the blanks that are around the frame as well. So it's just a really nice use and way to control the story. Another great positive of the 70-200 is the fact that when you think about the massive vistas, there are only so many of them in the world, and we're getting close to the point now where they've pretty much all been captured in really good light. So pulling out the 70-200 and getting a bit more detail, being a bit more creative, and just finding those interesting things that not everyone is going to see, you're going to be much more likely to end up with a unique shot that's going to be timeless and more interesting to people in the long run. So stick around for the Infoblast end frame at the end again. I think a few of you enjoyed that on the last video, but I just wanted to mention prime lenses. I absolutely love prime lenses. I really do. They're sharp, they're easy to use, they're often a bit cheaper as well, and they're just fun to use because they force you to think a lot more. However, for landscape photography, I'm just not convinced anymore, because zoom lenses these days particularly are of such good quality that they rival what prime lenses can do anyway. And if you're thinking about buying a prime lens, just if you're going to do it just for landscape photography, I'd think twice, because they're not as versatile, they're not as useful as you might think, and you're not going to get as much out of that lens as you are a zoom, in my opinion. If you love a prime lens and you've got to use that, then that's totally cool. But I just think if you're moving forward, zoom lenses are going to be more versatile, and I think you'll be a bit more creative with them in the long run. There might be a slight exception with astrophotography, where you want that bigger aperture that primes provide to get all that light in really quickly, but I'm not a massive expert on astrophotography, so let me know down below. Anyway, thank you so much for all the amazing comments from the video last week. I was blown away. I'd love also to hear what you think of the lens setup. What lenses do you use? All that stuff, leave it down below. Subscribe, share, like, do whatever you need to do, and I'll see you on another video very soon. I'm Adam, this is First Man Photography.